Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. For our guests this evening, if you want to keep your cameras on, you're welcome. You're also welcome to go ahead and turn your cameras off. Later during the Q&A, you're welcome to turn your camera back on. And I will also mute mics if I see that they're open. But again, you'll be able to unclick that and ask your question when it's time. You can also ask questions in the chat. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Todd, can I get a quick confirmation that I am showing the greeting screen with the Ohio and the Revolution?
Yes.
All right, thank you very much. All right, it's 7:01. I think we should probably get started. We are recording this session. We will package it up and share it via YouTube. Give us a day or two on that. And with that, I will hand it over to Todd Kleisman, the Executive Director of America 250 Ohio.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for our 6th installment of what we call Ohio and the Revolution. This is where we assemble historians and subject matter experts to discuss at least some of what was happening in the Ohio country and elsewhere during the times of the American Revolution. For those of you that were able to join us last time, January 30th, we broke a little from our traditional chronology of what we'd been doing up to this point to focus on the period of the 1780s and the Northwest Ordinance. And that was not random. We did this in the midst of the Northwest Ordinance Conference that was hosted at The Ohio State University January 30 and 31. That was a lot of fun, and we thank our friends at The Ohio State University and everyone else who played such a crucial role in pulling off that important event. We looked at that as an opportunity to pull the Northwest Ordinance out of relative obscurity and remind ourselves of the significance of that document, and especially its central role in shaping Ohio and the entire Midwest. You might say we're sort of building on that thought, that intent to bring out of obscurity some of the hidden figures from those Revolutionary War days. I am more than delighted to welcome several people who will help us discuss the contributions of some of the American Indian tribes, African Americans, recent immigrants, and women. These contributions are more significant than you might think. So let me introduce you to each of our panelists and we'll get started. So we're joined tonight by Dr. John Bickers. He's an assistant professor at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, where he researches early American history and is a citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. He is the author of The Miami Nation, A Middle Path for Indigenous Nationhood, an exploration of the political history of the Miami tribe through the 19th and early 20th centuries, and that will be available for pre-order and will be available this June. So thank you for joining us, John. Patrick Poole is a Hilliard resident and the author of the 2024 book, Black Patriots, Recovering a Lost History of the American Revolution. I happen to have that right here. Patrick has played an active role in the America 250 Ohio initiative to help document Revolutionary War veterans buried here in Ohio. Francis McGee Cromartie of Dayton is a former judge with the Montgomery County Court of Common Pleas and now serves on the America 250 Ohio Commission. She also serves as the co-chair of the America 250 Ohio Undertold Stories Committee and is an active member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. So thank you for joining us, Francis.
You're welcome.
And last but not least is Jen Altman, who serves as the executive director of the Strategic Homeland Partnerships for the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma. Prior to that, she served in several roles for the Ohio History Connection, which included leading the work to achieve inscription for Ohio's first ever World Heritage Sites, the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks. So thanks to each of you for joining us tonight. Welcome, panelists, and thank you for participating. There's a great line written by a Hessian soldier, it would have been a German soldier back in the day, at the end of the Revolutionary War, who wrote this: "Who would have thought that 100 years ago, that out of this multitude of rabble would arise a people who could defy kings?" George Washington is known to have complained about the militiamen and volunteers serving under him at various points during the war, expressing similar sentiments and frustrations from time to time. No one disputes the indispensable nature of George Washington's leadership or of Thomas Jefferson's revolutionary language in the Declaration of Independence, nor the common soldier, likely a farmer with a family and farmed that he desperately wanted to return to, who answered the call for American independence. We would not be here without their sacrifice and perseverance. In fact, thousands of those who survived the battles later made their way to Ohio and are buried under Ohio soil today. America 250 Ohio is using the nation's 250th anniversary to build on the work already done by groups like the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Sons of the American Revolution to better tell those stories. You can check out that initiative on our website, america250ohio.org. So you can see here on the image on your screen where there's a lot of great contributions being made to that from Ohioans all over the state. So we are forever grateful. So 250 years later, it is difficult to imagine the American colonists prevailing in the Revolutionary War without the contributions of the French especially, but also these hidden figures, thousands of Black patriots, American Indian allies, even teenagers, recent immigrants, and women. We probably know more about these contributions today than ever before. Tonight, they are our focus. We've called this webinar, "They Were Here, How the Revolution Was Shaped by Hidden Figures." I'm sure everyone following our discussion tonight knows that there were American Indians in North America for thousands of years before 1776. So let me start with you, John. In previous Ohio in the Revolution webinars, we've discussed to some extent not only the American Indian tribes who were in the Ohio country, but the mounds that were here built some 2,000 years ago, some of the evidence of past settlements, and to a smaller extent, some specific Indian tribal leaders. So we've had some of those discussions. As we begin this discussion tonight, I think it's important to point out the diversity of the American Indian tribes. There are today 575 federally recognized tribes. There can sometimes be a tendency for Americans to think of them in terms of Indians only in our past, from our history books. So let's acknowledge that tribal members like yourself, John, are here in Ohio making major contributions to our communities. But could we start by going back tonight, John, roughly 250 years? Could I ask you to take some time to paint a picture of what the Ohio country in the 1750s, 1780s from a tribal perspective? What are some of the key things you think we should know about the tribes that were here, and how did they navigate this brewing crisis happening on the East Coast that led to the American Revolution? John?
Thank you, Todd. Aya cheke, te pewe ne olaka koke o wahanungi kakikwe. Mawia wenzo ane, nila miamia mitosenia, palanzwa sekakweta ilapakasa ane. I just introduced myself in Miamia Tawenge, the Miami language, my heritage language, language that was spoken here in Ohio 250 years ago and continues to be spoken here. And I just said, hi, it's nice to see you all here. It's good to be here. As Todd said, my name is John Bickers. I'm professor of Native American history at Case Western Reserve University up in Cleveland, and I'm a citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma, and specifically a descendant of the Godfrey Band. And so there's a couple points you hit here, Todd, that I really want to focus on when we talk about what does the Ohio country look like 250 years ago. And one, I really want to kind of emphasize how much of a cosmopolitan place the Ohio country is, the diversity that is existing in Ohio before the American Revolution. Diversity in terms of Native American peoples. So there's often this misconception that all Native American tribes are all related to each other or similar or share cultural patterns. And there are groups that are related to each other. So my own tribe is very closely related to the Potawatomi and Shawnee, for example. But there are other tribes like the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Wyandot, the Wyandot, who speak not just completely different languages, but are from completely different language families, right? As closely related to my language as English is to Mandarin. Completely separate, unrelated languages and communities with different cultures and cosmologies and spiritualities that are really disconnected from each other and not related to each other, but we're still all sharing this space that we now call Ohio. But not just in terms of tribes, and not just in terms of Native Americans. Even before the Revolution, there are still French colonists that are still here from the French colonial days. That after the French Empire ceded its claims to the Great Lakes, they left their people behind, and so you have Francophones living in this area into the 19th century, right? You have British traders and some early British settlers starting to come into this area. And even there's diversity. You've got Anglos, you've got Scottish, Irish, each of which coming in with their own languages. So Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic are coming in and being spoken in these areas, right? You also have people of African descent that are already in Ohio at the time of the Revolution. There's been some amazing work, particularly by historian Taya Miles, that talks about the draw of slavery, and particularly African American slavery, in places like Detroit, where there are these huge slave societies being built initially by the French that continue into this period. And so you have people of African descent also in the Ohio country. So it's an incredibly diverse place at the time of the Revolution. Arguably more diverse than at any point until maybe today, right? There's just tons of different groups of people. The other point I really want to emphasize about the Ohio country and how Native peoples are experiencing it is, as a result of decades of European colonization, it has become a very dangerous place and a very violent place as well. Especially in the years leading up to the American Revolution, with the French and Indian War from approximately 1754 to 1763, followed immediately by Pontiac's War in 1763. You have Lord Dunmore's War in 1774. So you have all these moments where French and British, both British in terms of in England, but also British American colonists, are invading the Ohio country, trying to claim the Ohio country for themselves, trying to take it from Native peoples, and tribes are having to respond and defend their lands against violent European incursions. Another result of these violent incursions by Europeans is the spread of disease, right? There are various epidemics that plague the Great Lakes throughout the 18th century, leading up to the Revolution. Smallpox, measles, even the flu, and in the days before vaccines, where the flu is incredibly deadly. So there's all these epidemics, and we're beginning to also see the stages of land loss. Some of the kind of the signs of things to come. There are tribes in the Ohio country at the time of the Revolution, like the Lenape, the Delaware, who originate on the East Coast, right, in what's now New Jersey and Delaware, who have already been pushed out into the Ohio country by the British settlers who are establishing these colonies and forcing Native peoples further and further west. And so there's this sense of British and British American colonialism taking native lands. And so when the revolution comes, it's not as much of a shift as you might think in terms of the intense violence and destructiveness of war, because Native peoples in the Ohio country have been dealing with this level of violence and destruction for decades before the revolution even starts. So there's a lot of actually continuance from these earlier periods that Native people are dealing with and adjusting to, and trying to figure out how to navigate, right? There's not one particular perspective that Native peoples have in how to deal with the revolution or deal with Europeans, or even that concept of Europeans. Some try to ally themselves in the early years with the French against the British. Some ally with the British during the French and Indian War. After the French and Indian War, as we're getting closer to the Revolution, and during the Revolution, there are tribes that ally with the Patriots, that serve under, with George Washington, that serve fighting for the American cause, and there are Native peoples and tribal nations who also support the British cause, right? Or maybe don't support the British cause, but see the British colonists, these soon-to-be Americans, as an existential threat to their existence because of all this violence that's being brought into the area. And so they oppose the revolution, and they support British attempts to kind of quell the revolution as a way to protect their homelands and protect their communities and protect their families. The revolution is incredibly violent in Indian country, and particularly in Ohio. I mean, north of us in New York, which is parts of New York are considered the Ohio country in this period. George Washington sends under Sullivan's campaign sends troops during the Revolution to burn Haudenosaunee villages to the ground, destroy food supplies. The Haudenosaunee after the Revolution, and to this day, if you talk to them, they still refer to George Washington as the town burner. That because he gets this reputation as someone who is just destructive, destroying everything. In what's now Ohio, we have events like the Ganadahuton massacre, in which Lenape in Delaware, Moravian Christian converts who are pacifists. The Moravians don't believe in violence. They're kind of like the Quakers. They're pacifists, are slaughtered by a militia from Pennsylvania who instead of traveling eastward to fight in Boston and New England against the British, they're traveling westward into Ohio to massacre Native peoples. Right. So it's this incredibly violent space that Native peoples are trying to navigate and figure out where they can best survive. And different tribes are going to make different choices. And if you go through these histories, you see how difficult these choices are. And the last point I really want to hit home here, when we think about what's happening in the Ohio country, is the fact that regardless of how Native peoples are responding, regardless of what side they're taking, or if they're sitting out, there are also tribes that are just sitting out of these wars, and we don't have anything to do with this, that they're defending their homes, right? When we talk about, Ohio history today, many of us, myself included, who live in Ohio, we think about Ohio history and the Revolution, we think about our homes, right? Where our families live, going to these cemeteries and finding, Revolutionary War veterans who are buried in Ohio, and we can connect that to our ancestors and our families. Native peoples in the 1770s are doing the exact same thing. There's this beautiful quote from the Miami chief Tupia, or Francis LaFontaine, who writes a letter to President Polk in 1846 when our nation's being removed from Indiana and Ohio to Kansas. And he talks about how all our resistance to removal is because this land, he says, holds the bones and ashes of our forefathers. And how could we not want to remain in such a place? And that as Native peoples are responding, this is their home. That the revolution's being fought over, right? A revolution that is primarily not about Native peoples. It's war by British colonists against the British Empire that Native peoples are being dragged into. It's about protecting their homes and places we've lived since time immemorial, time beyond memory. We don't remember a time when we didn't live in these spaces. And they're at all times trying to make the best decisions to protect their homes from people who, even by the 1770s, it's very, very clear, want to take those homes away from them. There are quotes from Native leaders, even in the 1760s, even before the Revolution, talking to colonial officials and saying, we've heard stories that you want to exterminate our people, that you want to take our lands, that you want to take everything we hold dear, and we are going to resist that. We are going to fight that. And so when we talk about Native peoples in the Revolution, as much as we talk about the Americans and the Patriots trying to create a home, create a nation for themselves, Native Americans are trying to keep the home we have and not have it be taken away from us. I know I have a limited amount of time, so I think I'll stop there. I'll hand it back to you, Todd.
Okay, thank you, John. Yeah, there's so much to unpack there, but I think you did a great job sort of painting that picture. So let me ask Jen next. Jen, you've been working with the Shawnee and other tribes for quite some time now, World Heritage List designation and other things. And congratulations, by the way, on World Heritage.
Thanks.
And so the Shawnee have made huge strides reconnecting and reestablishing their heritage in recent years here in the state of Ohio. Achieving World Heritage status is obviously a huge accomplishment. Another major accomplishment was the establishment in 2024 of Ohio's 76th state park, and that's the Great Council State Park, which opened in Greene County and is operated, maintained by the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. You should definitely go if you haven't been. Perhaps the Great Council, I wondered, Jen, if you think that the Great Council could be a good tool to describe some of the larger themes of Shawnee history. I think that's what they try to do at the Great Council Park from this period of time we're discussing and how it's relevant to today. So tell us from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much, Todd, and thanks for having me on the panel today. And I want to get back to Great Council in just a second, but I just want to be clear up front so everyone understands that I'm an employee of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma. I'm not a tribal citizen, so I can't speak in the same way to the generational impacts this time period that a citizen can. But as you said, I've worked with many of the different tribes, but now work specifically for the Eastern Shawnee Tribe. And I'm also an Ohioan by birth, but my academic background is really in the Virginia contact period and Revolutionary War. So I have some experience in thinking about all of this from the west looking east and from the east looking west. And so that'll come up when I want to share some maps and some thinking about maps here in a couple minutes. So I think, you talk about Great Council State Park. One of the most important things there is today that there are 3 federally recognized Shawnee tribes, right? There's the absentee Shawnee tribe, there's the Shawnee tribe, and the Eastern Shawnee tribe. And all of them are represented in Great Council State Park. So that's really important. The state of Ohio reached out and worked with those tribal nations to put together the information at Great Council. It was all done through consultation. And so having the tribes be able to tell their own stories through that mechanism of Great Council State Park and do that here in Ohio is incredibly important to reconnect with the homelands. But that makes me think about how one of the most important points to make, maybe here at the outset, and I think John kind of touched on this just a little bit, is that the names of groups of people, right, they're really complicated. And when you think about the time around the American Revolution, naming is very complicated. So for any of us, what we call ourselves is always answered in a specific context, right? Anybody who's traveled internationally knows that if you're in another country and someone says, "Where are you from?" your answer is different than if you're across town from your home. So when we talk about the Shawnees or the Lenape or Delawares or even Virginians, we have to remember that those identities that sometimes can seem so cohesive, or like we'll see them on a map, right, with a circle around them, or clear in documents, that they're always shifting in time and in space. And that can conceal a lot of different opinions and different actions and even how those things change over time. So when I talk about the 3 federally recognized Shawnee tribes, they're distinct but related tribal nations that have different histories, and especially since the American Revolution. So again, if we could go back to the mid 18th century and ask Shawnee people and just walk up to them and say, "Hey, what group are you part of?" we wouldn't come up with those same 3 names, right? We would hear lots of different things. They might give the name of a town or a lineage or clan. Or so when we talk about Shawnees in the American Revolution, I hope people understand that term, like John said, it conceals different identities and opinions and perspectives, and like what's the best thing to do in this situation. Like any group of people, there's a great diversity of thought. So even like what political strategy is going to turn out best for us, right? So just to piggyback on what John said, we have to think about the American Revolution as part of a much longer effort by Shawnees and other Native people to secure their future in their own homelands. So you go way back, to the Beaver Wars that lasted throughout the 1600s. That was primarily between the Haudenosaunee and other tribes as a result of pressure from French and British fur trades. Shawnees were actually excluded in large part from the Ohio country during those conflicts and returned in the early 1700s as European American settlers were pushing to the west. Then Again, there's the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War from about 1754 to 1763. And you never know when people say Winston Churchill said a thing if it's true, but I once read that Winston Churchill, called this the first real world war, right? French and British on opposite sides with other nations getting pulled into it through alliances. And that included here native nations who were fighting for their land and making alliances to do what they thought would bring them the best outcome. So, you're going to gloss over a lot here, but then if you look at the map on the screen, right, in 1763, King George, he issues a proclamation that did several different things, including, and this is, again, a simplification, but it states that the land beyond that line, the proclamation line of 1763, is reserved to the, quote, several nations or tribes of Indians with whom England was connected. At least for the present time. And then there's this little clause later that says, until our further pleasure be known, right? So there's some ambiguity in like, what's the intention here? Is this really seen as a temporary thing? So royal subjects that lived illegally beyond the line were supposed to remove themselves. Of course, there were already thousands of subjects there. They didn't remove themselves. So again, it's part of the ongoing effort of tribes to maintain their own homelands. And if I could get the next slide, the conflict over land is ongoing in the Ohio River Valley, and the American Revolution, is again really just part of that. So I wanted to show this map because I want to talk for just a minute about how we today look back and think about things like the American Revolution. So this is a map that it shows, if you can see it, look closely, sort of generally where different tribes were at approximately this time. Right. Miami is in the western part of Ohio, and the Shawnees kind of in there, and Wyandottes up north, Iroquois or Haudenosaunee in the northeast, and Delaware, Lenape kind of on the southeast in this map. But what I really want you to think about for a minute is what this map also shows, right? Which is the names of modern towns that we have today. It even shows the shape of the state of Ohio, right? These are all things that didn't exist. So when we think about this time in the past, we're often like looking at it through this lens. So we get very used to relating the events of something like the American Revolution to our modern geography, right? Which of course would be incredibly foreign to anybody who lived at the time. So then if you can go to the next slide, please. This next map is Thomas Hutchins' map from 1764. It shows mostly the land we now call Ohio and reveals what the British knew about it at that time, or at least what they wanted to put on the map, right? Which is never everything. But you notice most prominently that it shows the locations and actually even the widths of waterways, the locations of prominent tribal leaders' towns. Waterways were incredibly important to Native people and the British. They're a means of transportation, and there was a strong desire, to control those. So all this is really important from a military point of view. And so I'm just trying to get us into, okay, well, maybe for a British person at the time, maybe this is sort of how they perceive the place that we're now in, right? So that looks different than the first map. And then if you can go to the next slide, please. All of this just an effort to make us think about different perspectives, right? This, I love this map. Excuse me. This map shows the Miami homeland, Miamionke, and John can certainly correct my pronunciation, right? So try for a minute to orient yourself to where modern day Ohio and state boundary is located on this map, right? And it might take a second. But it's part of what's now the state of Ohio is to the right on this map. And it's a very different view than most of us are used to seeing. I'm really grateful, actually, the Miami tribe has made and shared this map to convey a modern Miami view of the homeland, of their homeland. And of course, Miami people would fight to live in their own home, right? In the American Revolution and on either side of it. So thank you for that. The little, I wanted to diverge just for a moment into maps because that's so often how we think about these events, just to bring that awareness of, oh, you really, when you see a map that's conveying something about the revolution or colonial America, really think about whose map is it and what is it showing us, right? Um, so that kind of sets the stage, and I'll go quickly through the rest of this for the revolution. We couldn't possibly talk about all there is to talk about in the revolution, so I want to share just a couple of different stories that show different Shawnee perspectives on what to do in the revolution and the different actions that they took. Some Shawnees moved away from the front lines, and we don't hear as much about them, right? Many engaged in alliance with the British because the British promised them land, and the Americans were clearly grabbing, trying to take over that land. And some made the case for peace and neutrality. So, just two quick stories. Many people have heard of Chief Blue Jacket. He was a Shawnee chief, and actually, to connect this back to today, as a side note, today the Eastern Shawnee tribe includes Blue Jacket family members, and the tribe has named one of their administrative complexes the Blue Jacket Complex. So the Blue Jacket name is very much alive in the Eastern Shawnee tribe today. Blue Jacket participated in Lord Dunmore's War in the American Revolution. He was allied with the British during the Revolution. After the Revolution, he continued to fight for Shawnee land rights and with allies from other tribes helped lead the battle in 1791 that was known as St. Clair's Defeat, or that's what some of us call it today, in present-day Fort Recovery, Ohio. He fought at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. His army was defeated by the Americans, and he was then compelled to sign the Treaty of Greenville in 1795 that ceded much of present-day Ohio lands to the U.S. So think about that. His life and that long trajectory of fighting for homelands, right? So the American Revolution, the way I said that story was a little blip. It certainly didn't feel like a blip to him, but it's a bigger, longer fight. And then the second story, you see this marker here. This is a story of a Shawnee brother and sister, Cornstalk or Hokolesqua and Nanhalema. So Cornstalk participated in Lord Dunmore's War, led Shawnee warriors at the Battle of Point Pleasant to try to stop the Virginia militiamen from coming into the Ohio Valley. Ultimately, after the battle, he signed the treaty with Dunmore to end the war. And then when the revolution came, he and his sister, Nanhalema, who had villages next to each other or near each other, also, was a chief. They took the strong position that Shawnees should remain neutral. Then in 1777, Cornstalk went to Fort Randolph in modern-day West Virginia for a diplomatic mission, and he and 3 Shawnees were taken prisoner. And ultimately, because an American militiaman was killed by Native people, maybe or maybe not Shawnee people, Cornstalk and the others were killed in retaliation. So, of course, Shawnees were enraged, but his sister, Nanhalema, continued to support neutrality and even quietly helped share information with the Americans. So after the war, she asked for 1,000 acres for her services, but she was offered blankets and clothing instead. And then in 1786, she and her husband, Malintha, were captured and he was killed by Americans. So she was released, but she died later that year. And I show this monument to Nanhalema because as a Shawnee and as a woman, right, her story is different from others. She survives the deaths of her, her brother, her husband, but she was a chief and a leader and took a strong position for peace that wasn't always a popular position with her people. So I just wanted to share those differences to show those diverse opinions and how complex things were at the time. But no matter what tack, people took, Nanhalema's being different from Blue Jackets, it was about preserving the homelands. And then I think I have just one more slide real fast in here. And this is just to show the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma today. Shawnee people are, they're living vibrant and successful lives. The tribe is doing great things. You'll see just on the website all these different departments in the tribe. So taking care of people's housing and children and education. And you see the hotel and casino Indigo Sky there. And then there's Chief Glenna Wallace at the World Heritage Committee meetings. And then the photo at the bottom right is dancers at a stomp dance that I was at last weekend. So this vibrant culture is still around today, and Eastern Shawnee people are really working to reconnect with the homelands and share this back here as well. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jen. And we will have some time for questions from those of you in the audience once we get through a little bit more of the content. But wow, that's a lot of great information, Jen. Thank you. And by the way, you probably said this, but where is that Non-Halema monument? Is that in Oklahoma? Is that in Ohio? Where is that?
No, it's in Ohio. It's in Pickaway County. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you. Okay, well, let's talk about the African Americans engaged in the revolution. And I want to go to Patrick next. You've done an incredible amount of research on this. We mentioned your book, which chronicles this in great detail. So, Patrick, could you tell us a little bit about what led to your book and what you think is important for us to know about the contributions of Black people to the American Revolution?
Sure can. Thanks, Todd. The book is really a chronicle of my own discovery. It came as a result of research I was doing on the soldiers that fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill during COVID lockdown. And in the course of that research, I started coming across these Black patriots: Salem Poor, Peter Salem, James Arcule, Cuff Whitmore, who participated not only in Bunker Hill, but prior to that in the Lexington, Concord, and the Battle Road. And then I learned that Prince Esterbrook, who was a slave, served in Captain John Parker's Lexington militia, was wounded in the very first shots of the war. And today there's a monument to him right outside Buckman's Tavern across the street from Lexington Green. And so in the midst of that, when as I began to research the topic, I came across George Quintal's National Park Service study about Black patriots at Bunker Hill. He had already done the bulk of this work. It turned out that a lot of these soldiers ended up serving throughout the whole conflict. And so I began researching, and there is some really solid research. The Daughters of the American Revolution has put out 2 very meaty reports on Black patriots in the Revolution. There have been a lot of state-based, like focused on New Hampshire and other states, Connecticut. And as I began to absorb those, I came to the working hypothesis that if I kept pulling on this thread, I was going to find out that Black patriots were likely to be everywhere in the American Revolution. And that's exactly what I found. And I wrote the book to kind of chronicle some of that. Whether it was patriot victories or patriot defeats from Quebec all the way down to Georgia and Florida, Spanish Florida, all the way out to the wilderness, Fort Sackville, fighting with George Rogers Clark. The Black patriots are there. And so that's what I tried to document. And one of the remarkable things I found is very early on, you had completely integrated regiments. All 3 New Hampshire regiments at the beginning of the war had Black patriots among them as regular soldiers. The 6th Connecticut was probably the most prominent Connecticut regiment to have Black patriots in its units, but there were a number of others. At one point, they had 60 Black Patriots in their regiment. And of course, one of the more prominent Massachusetts regiments, the one commanded by John Glover, the Marblehead Regiment, was also completely integrated. And during the siege of Boston, we find out, and I write about the fact that when Dan Morgan had his Virginians show up during the siege of Boston, and they look around and see that there are these integrated units behaving in ways that were completely foreign to them from Virginia, that caused some real friction. And there was this debate about when Washington and Horatio Gates show up in Boston about whether we're going to continue to allow these Black Patriots to serve. And the Virginians immediately conclude, no, we're not going to let them do that. And then you begin to see some pushback from the New England leadership, and probably the most important document that we have is a testimonial that the leaders, the commanders at Bunker Hill sent to the Provisional Massachusetts Legislature about Salem Poor, who was a Black patriot. He is the only soldier from the battle personally singled out by the commanders for his bravery and heroism. And at that point, that gives, in terms of the timeline, that apparently gave General Washington a pause. And within 2-3 weeks, he's changed his position and sends a letter to John Hancock in Philadelphia saying, hey, I'm going to change this policy because we need these New England Black patriots, and we don't need to really poke the bear with the New England militias. So again, whether it's Patriot victories or defeats in the 8+ years of the American Revolution, you can find these Black patriots. And I mentioned the Glover Regiment that was completely integrated. And that was the regiment that moved Washington's army at the nearly catastrophic defeat at Long Island. And they were there throughout the New York, New Jersey campaign, Harlem Heights. The Marblehead Regiment was important for holding the line at Kips Bay, White Plains, all the way down through New Jersey until they end up in Pennsylvania on the south side of the Delaware River. And then the Marbleheaders are the ones who take Washington's army and, in the middle of a blizzard across the Delaware for the Patriot victory at Trenton. And then they promptly come back. And then you have Black patriots we know were directly involved in the Battle of Princeton. This is all part of the Great 10 Days that really preserved the Continental Army that didn't. So, I'm looking here at my notes. In 1777, you had the Saratoga campaign. And in Appendix 3 of my book, I identified 350 Black patriots. There were probably at least double that participated in the campaign. Most of those were from New England troops. And then you had the Philadelphia campaign going on almost simultaneously. The Battle of Brandywine, probably the largest battle of the war. And you had Ned Hector, who was one of the heroes. He was a Black teamster, and you can see one of the historical signs there on the screen, and a reenactor, and he's proclaimed as one of the heroes of the Battle of Brandywine, bringing supplies off under fire. And then, of course, you have Germantown, and finally the retreat into Valley Forge. And it's here at Valley Forge we know there are hundreds of Black patriots, some of whom have arrived after the victory at Saratoga. And I documented at least 50 Black patriots who died while encamped at Valley Forge. And what you're seeing there is actually a monument that was established by a Black sorority at Valley Forge in commemoration of the men and women who suffered that terrible winter. And then every year, at the time of when the army marched out of Valley Forge to pursue the British that were headed back to New York, there's a celebration at Valley Forge at this particular monument, honoring their service. Well, and as I document, there were literally hundreds, probably 800 or more Black patriots who fought at the Battle of Monmouth, probably the second largest battle of the war, which effectively battled the British to a draw and ended all major combat operations in the Northern Theater. And then some of the units that had been at Valley Forge fought at the Battle of Monmouth from Virginia and North Carolina, which had a fair number of Black patriots end up going south for the brutal Southern campaign. And the result of the Southern campaign is they eventually grind down General Cornwallis's army and were able to trap them at Yorktown, where, again, a number of Black patriots, some of which from the Black Regiment of the 1st North Rhode Island, participated as light infantry under Alexander Hamilton in the taking of Redoubt 10, which essentially ended the siege and prompted the British to surrender. So, that's all what I wanted to document. And sadly, I could only get about 30, maybe 40% of my research into the book, because at some point you just have to stop. But I really did the book as a testament so other researchers and scholars can go back and trace the breadcrumbs and continue to research this important part of the American Revolution, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, I remember you lamenting in the book that so much was left on the cutting room floor, so to speak. So, the America 250 Ohio Commission, we often point to Fort Lawrence in Tuscarawas County as the only Revolutionary War fort in Ohio. It was built in 1778. It's getting some work done now. Our fourth panelist, Frances McGee Cromartie, has a unique tie to Fort Lawrence. Frances serves on the America 250 Ohio Commission. She was appointed by Governor DeWine this winter. So Frances, please tell us about your work with the Daughters of the American Revolution and why Fort Lawrence is so important to you.
Thanks, Todd. It's been interesting listening to everybody else's story, because everybody else's story, going from the larger picture down to my individual picture, we all interact, and you're going to hear a little bit about it. And so I appreciate you putting us together as a panel. I'm a direct descendant from of one of the people, he's called a free man of color. He today would be called biracial. In his day, he was called mulatto, but he was treated as if he was pure African. He was born as an indentured servant at birth. He was, because his parents were not wed, he became a criminal, and he was sentenced to 31 years of indentured servitude. However, he was fearless and went to court and sued for his freedom. And that's how he ended on the American colonial frontier. And so he was one of the people who helped build Fort Lawrence. And so I always tell people that that was part of my story, part of the reason I wanted to participate, or at least join the DAR, was because I wanted to honor my patriot. But in doing research, I found that there were at least 8,000 people of indigenous and or African descent who served at various causes, as you've heard from Patrick and you've heard from our other speakers. And I wanted to, every time I lift up or discuss my patriot, I want people to know I'm lifting up the people who fought, whose descendants don't know that they come from such brave men and women. So that's the reason I joined the DAR. That's the reason I've stayed there. And when I first started my research into my patriot, whose name is Henry Dorton, um, and the family name is now changed to Dalton through the years. That's what happens when you have other people telling you what your history or story is. They change your name and change a lot of things. But when I started doing my research in 2016, I found that a lot of the things that were happening contemporaneous today were also happening in this 1776. We had people who, you know, weren't married and had children, but we didn't make them criminals. We had people serving in the military, and they served 3 separate tours of duty, as my patriot did. So there were a lot of parallels, and I thought that was really, really interesting. And it's interesting that Jen mentioned Cornstalk because he played a part, although this is before my patriot actually came into being. But Cornstalk had gone and told the settlers that something was going to happen, and he had told them that earlier in the year, and then they took him hostage. And as a result of skirmishes that were taking place on the um, West Virginia side, my patriot was called in, he was a militiaman, and he was called to protect a personal fort, not a government fort. You can tell the difference when you do the research in that. If it says Fort Pitt, then that means that it's a government fort. But if it says Pitt's Fort, that's a personal fort. So he was called to protect that area. And when his unit went to check on someone's personal fort, they found that it had been burned to the ground and people had scattered. And what happened is then his unit was part of a group called that was designated as the Foreman Massacre. What had happened is they get to this area near current Moundsville, West Virginia, and they find this fort burned down. So the captain asks the scout, but doesn't listen to the scout's report as to the best way to get back to Fort Pitt. Or actually, it was Fort Henry, I'm sorry, that was closer. They started at Fort Pitt, but then they were sent to Fort Henry. But what ends up happening is they're ambushed by some of the nations who are there. And my patriot happened to be a survivor. As a result of that, of course, there's a Continental Congress investigation, and they decide in 1778 we've got to build more fortifications because from Fort Pitt, the next fortification is in Detroit. So my patriot was sent with a group of 1,500 people to build two forts. The first one was Fort McIntosh, which is on the Beaver Valley. It's no longer there. And then the second one was Fort Lawrence. Unfortunately, it took too long to build Fort McIntosh, and when they get to the Tuscaroras, it's like mid-October. They end up having to suffer through an early winter. They had a snow in October. The wood that they had was green, so when it dries, what happens? It creates large chinks. But Henry Dorton was one of the lucky ones. Right before Christmas, he gets his second, what we would say he gets his second order of discharge, and he is able to leave. But the people who are left behind, they are under siege under the direction of Colonel Hamilton from the British, and the native or indigenous nations lay siege. And so from January 1779 until March 1779, they're under siege, have no food, water, they're boiling shoe leather. And so, but he got his second tour of duty, second order of discharge. And then he also served at Yorktown. So my patriot was like really a regular service person. He wasn't anybody who's really important, but he is one of those people that the Daughters of the American Revolution documented in a book that they created, which is called Forgotten Patriots. And they had researchers who documented and found that there were more than 9,000, between 5 and 9,000 people of color who served in the Revolutionary War. And so one of the things that keeps me in the DAR, because you asked about what I'm doing with DAR, one of the things that keeps me in is that they're changing their attitudes. You know, I think a lot of the racism that we see or that we are affected by today happened during the early 20th century and maybe during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, because some people were not allowed to be in and, you know, might be in or involved in society. And so what DAR is trying to do now is to give a wider picture of the way that it really was. So we're welcoming people of Spanish background who paid taxes that helped support the war. We are allowing or highlighting the stories of men and women of color. The book Forgotten Patriots, if you go on the DAR website, it's 900 pages worth of documentation by scholars, and you can download that book and use it in research. And I think it's really important that people do that. What else? I just think that it is important for those who served or who are descendants of those who served to be a part. And so that's why I'm involved. And that's why I like to talk about Fort Warner.
Yeah, fantastic. A quick aside, I became the director of the America 250 Ohio Commission back in 2022. We were just getting started. I was invited to address the state convention of the Ohio DAR. And that's the day that Frances and I met. And I found out that her father was the mayor of Dayton when I was growing up. And so one thing led to the next. I heard about her tie to Fort Lawrence. And I said, this is someone we have to get to know each other. So glad that we did. So thanks, Frances. And your work with the DAR is a very nice segue to talk about the contributions of women during the Revolutionary period. And so this question really is for anyone on our panel here. But I will say, Patrick, you've told me you are researching a book on the topic. And, I'd say let's talk about the contributions of women, often unseen but important. And again, this is for anybody. What should we know about how women shaped this period of time and made contributions? Anybody want to get us started?
Patrick, if you're not going to step in, I will.
Please do.
Just last week, I attended a DART in Grove City, Ohio, and part of the tea was to talk about the contribution of the women, because we all know about the Boston Tea Party in which the men participated, but very few know about the Edenton Tea Party and what the women did there. They were the ones who signed a proclamation, which said they will not drink tea. They said that it was determined that they were the ones who drank most of the tea. And when some of these horrible acts came out, they said, we're not going to drink tea. We're going to spin our own clothes. We're not going to be so dependent on Britain. And so it was a real sacrifice for the women to be doing these things when they were getting a lot of their goods and services from Britain. So that was part of the tea. The ladies put on a play, which was really educational and gave me more information about that. But a lot of the women's resolve, the women were the ones who had the resolve. I also told Todd an aside about the founding of the DAR. When the Sons of the American Revolution were founded around, I think it was 1896, the purpose was that they were going to have men whose were descendants of men who served in the Revolutionary War. And one man objected because he descended from a woman in New Jersey, and I believe her name was Hannah Arnett. And she's the one who like shamed the men. She was a widow and she ran a bar. She heard the men talking about wavering, which side were they going to join. And she's the one who cajoled them into joining the Patriot side. And he wanted to originally join, and they had told him no. And he's like, look, if it hadn't been for this lady, these people in New Jersey wouldn't have joined the Patriot cause. So I think based upon a lack of diversity, based upon the way that society was set up, a lot of these stories were not told.
Patrick, what have you found out in your research about the contributions of women?
Well, in fact, I've been to Hannah Arnett's grave there in Union, New Jersey, and I think in the 251st anniversary of Lexington and Concord in the Battle Road was earlier this week, and today I was writing about the women of Lexington, and what I was specifically writing about was how years before, the women of Lexington had begun spinning on a regular basis as a means of protest against initially the Stamp Act and then the Intolerable Acts, et cetera, as things continued to get worse in Boston and Massachusetts. And one of the questions I'm really grappling with is how much of the American Revolution occurred before the war began. I think it very well may have been most of that, and you run into figures like Mercy Otis Warren, who should have, statues of her because she had voluminous correspondence with virtually every leader, male or female, in the war, and had a huge influence on, in particular, John and Abigail Adams. She was definitely seen as the senior partner in the beginnings of their relationship. So it's something that's fascinating to me. I think there's a sense that men went out and fought the war and women kept the home fires burning, and that's just factually wrong. Women participated in all kinds of ways, even with the Continental Army. In fact, here in Ohio, in Washington County, is Mary Bird Lake is buried down in Washington County, and she was the head matron of the Continental Army Hospital in Fishkill, New York. And Fishkill was basically the city that the Continental Army ran on, and the hospital was an important part. And even here in Ohio, and we have a number of other prominent women from the American Revolution. Elizabeth Zane's very famous, among others. I think it's. I'm looking forward to continuing to write and think about that very part of the revolution.
And I think, though, we need to lift up the names again that was discussed, Nan Halima, and there was another lady, I'm sorry, I can't remember her Native American name, but her name was Nancy Ward. And she was another lady, her name was similar, but I'd have to have it written in front of me. But we had a lot of people from all races, all backgrounds. And again, not just white women, but we need to make sure that we include all of the women, it's mentioned Phyllis Wheatley was a woman of African background who helped influence the war.
If I
Okay,
could just,
yeah, go ahead, Jen.
I was just gonna say real quick, I believe Nancy Ward was Cherokee, if I have that correct. And I just wanted to say really quick, I really appreciate all that the two of you added, and that I just want to say the term camp follower, right? That there were women that were marching along, but the American and the British sides, but actually in camp doing a lot of the really hard labor of moving an army and feeding everyone and clothing everyone. And that was an incredibly hard and big role that they played.
For sure. Okay, well, we're going to get to questions from the audience here in just a moment, but let's talk for just a quick moment as we run a little bit low on time here. The contributions of recent immigrants and teenagers. I recall this being highlighted by Ken Burns in the recent PBS special that aired in the fall. I think he was asked by someone what surprised him most about his years of research that was done for the American Revolution documentary. And it was this, that so many women, African Americans, recent immigrants, and teenagers played such large, important roles. So I thought that was really interesting. A quick note here about teenagers. We just had a social media post the commission did about John Gray, who was a teenager during the American Revolution. He was the last documented Revolutionary War veteran to pass away in 1868. He is buried in Noble County, and so we had a lot of good reaction to that post pretty recent, just a few months or a few weeks ago. Anyway, just thought I'd mention that topic and see if anyone wants to comment on the teenagers, the recent immigrants, others that we haven't had a chance to get to.
I think one thing I'll kind of say, jump in on that is, I think something we often don't think about is throughout the revolution, throughout all these moments in the late 18th century, is how young everybody is. I think maybe it's the powdered wigs, I'm not sure, but we think of the founding fathers as all people as like maybe in their 40s or 50s, these elder statesmen kind of figures, and they're all young. They're all so young. They're in their 30s, they're in their 20s. There's a little, little later, but when William Henry Harrison's appointed the first governor of Indiana, he's like 25 or something. I mean, these are all really, really young people. And so when we're talking about who's fighting in the revolution, yeah, it kind of makes sense. We don't think about that, but it kind of makes sense that you have a lot of, particularly older teens, 17, 18, 19-year-olds who are at the forefront of this, right? These are the people that have the energy, they have the change. And if you look at social movements throughout US history, whether it's the American Revolution or it's in the 1960s or or in 2020s, whatever it is, it's young people that are leading these movements, that are the ones who are willing to break with tradition and to say, let's try something different. And it's a bit simplistic, but what is the American Revolution if not a group of people saying, let's try something different, right? And it's such a young, not I'll say youth movement, but there's all so young and younger than we always think.
Such a great point. Thank you, John. Okay, well, I know it's hard to cover all this ground in 75 minutes, but we've packed in a lot. Chris Hurtubise, I might ask if you have any questions from the audience that we ought to try to field.
Yeah, Todd, we do. I'm going to go back up in the stream a little bit. Our very first person to ask a question was Shauna Jones, and she went ask something of Dr. Bickers. Shauna, are you still with us? Let's see.
Looks like she is.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Shauna.
So, Dr. Bickers, my fourth great grandfather and my fourth great grand uncle, respectively, my great grandfather Jacob Roush and grand uncle George Roush were both described as Indian scouts during the Revolutionary War. George was specifically involved in the Battle of Point Pleasant. I am curious as to what that might have entailed. It seems, from my limited perspective, that it probably wasn't such a great thing when we think about it in context of like today, right? So if you might be able to describe what that might have meant and how their involvement in the Revolutionary War would have impacted the tribes along the Southeast Ohio River, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Actually, before I answer, if we can go back to Jen's map, the Hutchinson map.
Give me just a second.
Yeah, this is gonna go directly into answering your question here, because Indian Scouts is an official position in various state militias and later the U.S. military, that does kind of, as the name implies, their job is to go and map out and trace out these areas in which whether it's the militia or the military, however you want to label them, are going to be moving into, and so. When we go back to this Hutchinson map, well, you see when the British are mapping out Ohio, there's so much they don't know, and there's so much that's not on there because they really don't have a sense of what this all looks like, or they're just starting to develop a sense of what this all looks like. And maps like these aren't necessarily commonly available. So there might be one guy in Philadelphia that has this map that can maybe do some troop movements. The people on the ground don't. And so you have to have people who are able to move through these backcountry spaces and know what tribes are there, where their villages are, what their trading routes are, what the lines of communications are. If their scouts are any good, they're going to be able to speak at least a couple Native American languages because they're going to be able to communicate, especially with tribes that are allied to the United States, right? So if they're going through like in southwestern Ohio, there are groups within the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy that are allied with the Patriots. They're probably going to need to be able to speak Seneca, right? Or maybe be able to speak Oneida or one of the Haudenosaunee languages as they go and interact with these groups, or even with tribes that are more neutral, right? That they can still have interactions with, like the Shawnee. Like if they're going to interact with Cornstalk or his sister, you're going to want a scout that can speak Shawnee, or at least enough to be able to have a line of communication. And so these are the people that are kind of the first wave of these troop movements into these spaces. Now, in some cases, they're going in there literally planning an attack and trying to figure out where people are and where the villages are so they can attack and destroy them. In other cases, they're trying to navigate all these other military movements around them and trying to figure out where's the safe village, right? Where's a village where we can go and trade that we're allied with, we can trade or share information with. And maybe I can go find this Lenape village and they can tell me what the Shawnee are doing, right? And they can tell me what's going on here. So Indian Scouts are incredibly important during the Revolutionary War and throughout. By the 1790s, the United States has a dedicated unit of Indian Scouts whose literal job is just to travel across Ohio tracking Native American movements because they have to know where people are and where the rivers go and where the rivers are and all these different things. So it's a position obviously we don't have anymore, but it's incredibly important during the Revolution to manage troop movements.
Great. We also have a question from Jan and then from Conrad Hines. Jan's question is, my cousin is in the DAR for the Ann Simpson Davis line. But recently she said they are unqualifying people because there isn't as much documentation for women. Does someone want to take that question?
I think to get an answer to that question, because I think number one, there's several questions in one. One is, how do we get more information on the records of women? And I think the answer to that question may be, maybe we need to enlist various people who are listening on this podcast to volunteer to transcribe. I said listening, I didn't say participating. But what I'm saying is to help transcribe a lot of these records. There are a lot of records that are available, but people do not necessarily have access to them because most of us don't have the money necessarily. It's expensive to do genealogical work. A lot of times you have to go to where the records are because they have not been transcribed. So that's the answer to one question. And if the question is why is Ann Simpson Davis not recognized for DAR, I can't answer that.
Actually, I can chime in here. I think the question is related to her own documenting that service that is commonly believed she participated in during the Philadelphia campaign. But the fact is, her husband is a documented Revolutionary War patriot for both DAR and SAR. So they would be able to qualify under his service, which is, again, already documented.
Thank you. Conrad had his hand up at one point. Conrad, would you like to ask your question on camera and with your mic, or you can drop it in the chat?
Hi, Conrad.
Okay, do you hear me?
Hey, there you are.
Yes.
Hey, Conrad.
Okay. Oh, hello. Really, more than anything, it's just a comment regarding age in teenagers. At that time of the Revolutionary War, the average age was like between 35 and 40. So the idea of, and so far as males, they were pretty much considered close to being an adult at 13 and taking on a trade and really, going to work. So I think teenagers were very serious about their future and participating in the Revolutionary War at this time.
Thank you, Conrad.
Yeah, I have a teenager at home, and it's hard to imagine. I think that our perspective on teenagers may be a little different. Yeah, back in the day. Hey, that's great. We are now at 8:15. I don't know if there are any more questions, but maybe we could stick on another minute or two if there are. And if there aren't, I'm gonna take a point of privilege to thank, in addition to our panelists, Chris Hurtubise and Chris Bluebaws really helped us out to assist us this evening. But many thanks so much to all of you for participating, being with us this evening. There's probably 150 other things you could have been doing, but we're so grateful you joined us tonight. So special thanks to Francis and Patrick and John Bickers and Jen Altman. Thanks everyone for being part of the fun this evening. And I think we'll wrap it up here. We will be hosting at least one more episode of Ohio in the Revolution later this year. Stay tuned. And thank you so much, all of you, for joining us tonight. I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday evening. And be sure to follow us at America 250 Ohio the rest of this year. We got a whole bunch of things packed into 2026. So thanks for being on the journey with us. Thanks, everyone.
Yep.
Bye.
Thank you.